Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Stefano Magaddino, the quiet and calculating boss who ruled Western New York for more than 50 years. Known as the Old Man, Magaddino built his power through patience, discipline, and silence. To some, he was a respected elder who kept peace among families. To others, a shadowy figure whose influence stretched far beyond Buffalo's borders. Before we begin, like this video. We're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family, and share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you more powerful stories. And stay with us because the next story will be even more fascinating, and I know you'll love it. Subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, close your eyes and imagine the quiet streets of Buffalo, the whispers of meetings held behind closed doors, and the empire of a man who ruled not with noise but with silence. Settle in and let the story of Stefano Magaddino guide you into the night. He entered the world in 1891 in Castellammare del Golfo, a town of steep streets and salt air on the Sicilian coast. Houses clung to the hillside, the way families clung to one another. Work was hard, pride ran deep, and arguments could last generations. Boys grew up learning who owed whom, who helped whom, and who remembered. Stefano learned patience early. He watched elders settle quarrels in courtyards where nobody raised a voice. He saw that the man who spoke least often won. Faith and family shaped him, and so did the rough economy of a place that gave people few chances at comfort. In the 1,910 seconds, he crossed the ocean like many from his town, carrying habits as valuable as cash. New York's Italian neighborhoods had familiar smells bred at dawn, tomatoes simmering, cigar smoke on stoops, but they also had new pressure. Men scrambled for work, and every corner already belonged to someone. The Castellammarese diaspora stuck together. Among them were names that would echo for decades: Salvatore Maranzano, Vito Bonventre, and a younger cousin who would later rise in New York, Joseph Bonanno. Stefano wasn't loud in that world. He listened, delivered messages, proved loyal, and learned the contours of an expanding underworld that mixed old country rules with American opportunity. He found early mentors who prized order over flash. Bootleg liquor would soon flood the streets, but even before Prohibition, certain trades and favors were watched by men who valued quiet influence. Stefano learned what each handshake meant, how a debt rippled through a neighborhood, how a soft visit could steer a decision better than a threat. He also heard his name travel back across the Atlantic. Sicilian authorities tied his circle to a local feud and a 1,913 killing. Records from that era swing between rumor and charge, but the story followed him. He denied wrongdoing, and he never returned to clear it. For him, the future had shifted to America. The Volstead Act turned a national experiment into a thriving black market. In cities, you heard dance bands and clinking glasses behind locked doors. Outside, you smelled raw spirits from barns and basements. On a map, nothing seemed more inviting than the Niagara frontier, where a river, a lake, and a pair of bridges linked breweries, distilleries, and thirsty towns. Caught between New York's appetite and Ontario's supply, the corridor became a test of organization. It needed scouts who knew back roads, drivers who stayed calm at checkpoints, and bosses who kept peace among crews who'd otherwise fight over every case. By the early 1,920 seconds, Stefano had shifted toward that border. Niagara Falls and Buffalo didn't look like New York City, but they held the same puzzle: politics, police, businessmen, and neighborhoods that had their own rhythms. He chose a front that fit his temperament, a funeral home that sent one message: dignified, reliable, discreet. The work had always suited men who wanted to project respectability. It gave him a quiet office, a reason to meet anyone in town, and a way to move through nights without drawing attention. People started calling him the Undertaker. He didn't argue with the nickname. Local leadership before his arrival had seen waves of change. Strong personalities rose and fell in Buffalo's Italian colony, and the Prohibition wind blew hardest on those who tried to grab fast money without broader alliances. An older figure, Angelo Palmieri, held influence for a time, navigating between crews while keeping lines to more established Manhattan power brokers. When Palmieri passed in the mid-1900s, 920 seconds, gaps opened. Stefano did not fill them with speeches. He placed trusted men near the river, near customs posts, near union halls, and in back rooms where club owners counted cash. He spoke with merchants who hated chaos more than anything. He met clergy and ward healers. He remembered favors. Slowly, he became the person others consulted when a dispute touched the liquor trade, gambling houses, or protection schemes. Those years set a pattern that outlived prohibition. His operation focused on streams of income that didn't flash for headlines: bookmaking, numbers, card rooms, dice games, and loans offered to people who couldn't walk into a bank. He didn't need strangers. He needed dependable locals who wanted steady earnings. He let captains run neighborhoods as long as they kept order and paid their share. If a problem arose, he preferred a meeting. If two men argued over a block, he reminded them what instability cost. He paid attention to police habits, which reporters were nosy, which judges were strict, and which public officials preferred a quiet district over a noisy crackdown. He valued forethought as much as muscle, and his circle learned to follow that lead. The border made him different from many other bosses. Across in Ontario, families with Sicilian roots mingled with Calabrian clans, and each side of the river saw the other as both opportunity and risk. Contacts developed in Hamilton, Toronto, and smaller towns near the lake. Johnny Papalia grew into a feared name north of the line. The Lupino family rooted deeply in Hamilton. Canadian partners appreciated an American ally who kept arrangements stable and disputes contained. Reports from both countries tied Stefano's network to cross-border gambling, currency schemes, and, according to many investigators, narcotics routes that agents tried hard to map. Direct proof at the top level often proved elusive, but law enforcement on both sides considered his enterprise a hub. He never accepted those labels in public. He simply kept a rhythm, low profile, constant revenue, and discipline. When the alcohol ban collapsed in 1933, many bootleggers who'd lived fast discovered they had no plan. Stefano's approach ensured he didn't depend on one law. Gambling didn't go away. High-interest loans remained useful to businesses that wanted cash without questions. Strong hands still mattered in markets and construction. Racketeering in unions became a reliable lever. Control the hiring hall, steer contracts, and you control more than a street corner. In the Buffalo area, trucking, produce markets, and parts of the building trades offered leverage if your men sat on key committees or steward positions. He rarely sat on a dais. He made sure his emissaries did. Payments flowed quietly. When newspapers jumped on a scandal, he stepped back and let a lieutenant take the glare. Then, when the fuss faded, the machine resumed its hum. His reputation beyond Buffalo grew during the Castellamarese War that engulfed New York City around 1929 to 1931. On one side stood Joe Masseria, a boss who believed power should belong to the old guard that met him at his table. On the other side stood the Castellamarese block around Salvatore Maranzano. Stefano wasn't in New York's front lines, but his loyalties were no secret. He and other Castellamarese figures distrusted Masseria's greed. They backed Maranzano's push to reorganize the underworld in a way that acknowledged territorial rights and curbed needless feuds. When the war ended and Maranzano briefly sat atop a new structure, Stefano's family in Buffalo was treated as a recognized seat with defined territory. After Maranzano's abrupt fall and Lucky Luciano's redesign of the national arrangement, a body known as the Commission gave powerful regional bosses a forum to settle disputes. Stefano, a senior figure from the start, had a chair. He rarely spoke for the press, yet inside that forum he earned a reputation for cautious, sometimes stubborn positions. He didn't like surprises. In the 1,930 seconds, he tightened his grip on Western New York. Crew bosses in Niagara Falls, Buffalo, and the outlying cities rendered an agreed-upon share. Gambling dens paid to run without raids. Bookmakers operated phones from apartments and candy shops. The house took its percentage and kicked up. Businesses that wanted stability contributed. If a bookmaker strayed, he got a reminder. If a captain shorted tribute, he got a visit. Violence happened in that era across many cities, but he tried to make it the exception. Investigators attributed some unsolved killings to his camp, often with logic that matched motive and opportunity, but public trials tying him personally to those acts never stuck. His skill lay in managing people who could smooth a problem before it became a headline. The Undertaker persona helped. He stood in doorways at wakes, shook hands, and expressed sympathy. He donated to causes the community applauded. In meetings with city figures, he sounded polite and conciliatory. While some bosses took photographs at charity dinners, he let others pose. He knew that the safest power is the kind people only hint at. To his inner circle, he could be demanding, even severe. He expected totals on time. He kept notes in his head, and, according to investigators who later searched his vaults, in places they struggled to find. He distrusted extravagance. People around him learned that big cars and loud talk attracted the wrong eyes. Across the border, his reach intertwined with Canadian partners in a way that crossed decades. Hamilton-based figures managed their own culture and rules, but strategic choices still passed through Niagara Falls. A jockeying of influence in Toronto benefited from meetings in quiet rooms overlooking the river. Canadian groups dealt with their own police and press. Stefano offered the one thing authorities rarely stop: continuity. Even when investigations disrupted a group in one city, the larger framework remained. Plans were adjusted, routes were redrawn, and the revenue resumed. Government agencies tried to prove Canadian narcotics shipments reached American cities through his corridor. Some of his associates were arrested for drug offenses over the years. Some served time. He insisted he had no hand in it. Agents believed otherwise, publishing reports that sketched lines from southern Europe to Montreal to the Niagara frontier and out to the Midwest. The top remained insulated. His family life stayed sheltered from reporters. He raised children, including a son, Peter, who grew into a role within the organization. Relatives and in-laws often took trusted positions in this world. The circles of loyalty overlapped with the circles of kin. A cousin in New York, Joseph Bonanno, climbed into national prominence, and that bond tied two power centers. Over time, that tie became as much pressure as strength. Alliances between New York and Buffalo had to absorb conflicts born in distant boroughs. Still, throughout the 1,930 seconds, Stefano's house felt unshakable. He hadn't gone to prison. He hadn't been forced into exile. He hadn't burned bridges with his base. His rivals respected his patience, even when they disliked his terms. Police in Western New York knew his name but found him elusive. He didn't hawk influence in public the way some ward bosses did. He rarely left a paper trail that linked him directly to a banked payoff or a bribe. When arrests came, they touched bookmakers, gamblers, and lower-level collectors. Sometimes a mid-level figure tried to flip. Promises were made, stories told. Then juries heard about gambling phones and backroom dice, not about the man who greeted neighbors at funerals. When prosecutors tried to widen a case, evidence thinned. He paid lawyers and waited. If a cop got too aggressive, he instructed his men to stop doing the thing that cop was following. The officers grew frustrated. Then, as habits relaxed, the routines restarted. By the late 1,930 seconds, his domain had boundaries everyone recognized. Other ethnic mobs existed in Buffalo Irish groups in some wards, Polish crews in others, but they tended to control taverns and neighborhoods without challenging the broader structure that Stefano enforced. He allowed room for smaller fish as long as they didn't bite his lines. He emphasized that peace made everyone money. People who wanted fireworks could head to New York City, Chicago, or Detroit. In western New York and across the river, the Undertaker wanted the lights low, the machines steady, and the weekly collections placed in envelopes without fuss. The Depression, and then the approach of war, tested every racket. Federal attention increased. Some union rackets grew more profitable with government contracts and military production. But they also drew scrutiny. Stefano adjusted by spreading risk. He refused to let any single crew hold a monopoly long enough to become a second power base. He shifted personnel, promoted a quiet earner while reassigning an aggressive one to less sensitive terrain. He kept old country friends close, but he cultivated younger men who had American schooling and could read a government notice without tipping their hand. He had grown from an immigrant apprentice to a regional arbiter. Now he worked to ensure that if a storm came, the structure beneath him would hold. Night after night, the river kept its constant song, and tourists marveled at the mist. In rooms where cards flipped, phones rang, agreements solidified, and tributes were counted. A man with formal clothes closed his office door on a dim street and sat with his thoughts. Length of rule brings its own risk. Fatigue, resentment, and the temptation among ambitious subordinates to test the old man. To survive, a boss has to outweight moods, absorb minor rebellions, and grant just enough reward to keep the next in line from looking for a new banner. Through these years, Stefano showed a talent for boring routine into every profitable thing. That dull steadiness, hated by some, proved his sharpest tool. He had weathered prohibition's rise and fall, a reordering of the national underworld, and the early investigations that tagged him as a power. He was far from finished. Factories along the lakes roared through the war years, and ration books tucked in kitchen drawers changed the rhythm of daily life. Sugar, gasoline, and rubber moved by permit, yet side doors still opened for people who didn't want to wait. In that climate, quiet arrangements thrived. Men with steady income wanted games and loans. Merchants wanted trucks to keep rolling, and disputes handled without headlines. The old pattern held: if a neighborhood relied on someone who kept problems small, that person gained weight in every conversation. Stefano leaned into that idea. He didn't chase quick scores. He built routines that outlasted political wins. Crews in Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and the smaller cities nearby worked under captains who knew boundaries. Money entered through a dozen streams, betting on cards and sports, numbers slips, unlicensed clubs, and the kind of high-interest advances businesses took when banks said no. He watched over the union halls that controlled hiring on key sites. A membership card in the right local meant access to jobs and leverage with contractors. In Western New York, a labor organization in the building trades became a lever his circle pulled with care, placing shop stewards who could decide who worked and which company won a contract. With union dues and votes in play, public officials respected the person who could keep people working or stop a job without shouting. He invested time in allies beyond the city lines. East along the southern tier, an associate named Joseph Barbara managed businesses and a wide network of contacts. Barbara had bottled soft drinks and then branched out, buying land in the hills above the Susquehanna Valley. He presented himself as a successful businessman with a taste for gardens and barbecue, but people in the life knew he answered to Stefano. That connection placed a friendly house on the state's other side, a place where visitors could gather far from big city reporters. North of the border, relationships deepened with Hamilton and Toronto figures. Giacomo Lupino became a pillar in Hamilton. A younger man, Johnny Papalia, grew into a feared operator whose crew understood hustle without chaos. Canadian partners handled their towns while recognizing that the flow of money and goods across bridges required coordination. Meetings took place in living rooms, funeral chapels, back booths, and quiet parks. The aim never changed: keep revenue stable and disputes contained. After the war, people had cash to spend. Returning soldiers found work at plants that hadn't yet slowed. Bookmakers handled more wagers than ever, sometimes taking calls in a candy store front, sometimes from an apartment where a phone rang day and night. The numbers game sent runners down side streets in the morning and into taverns at night. Clubs filled with music, and games carried on in rooms where police liked to drop by only if they had a complaint they couldn't ignore. The Undertaker's men knew which officers wanted peace, and which ones wanted a show raid every so often to satisfy a chief. Adjustments were made. A phone was moved. A doorman changed. An operation went dark for a week, then resumed. The point was not to avoid every arrest. The point was to avoid cases that touched the core. Public attention turned to organized crime with force in 1950 and 1951, when a Senate committee toured the country under Senator Estes Kefauver. Televised hearings introduced the phrase syndicate to living rooms. Names were read into the record, maps were drawn, and photographs shown. Buffalo's rackets entered that story, and Stefano's name appeared in transcripts as a key figure in Western New York. He did not chase microphones. When subpoenas reached his circle, responses were polite and limited. Associates sometimes claimed the Fifth Amendment, sometimes evaded with vague memory. The hearings made life less comfortable, but they didn't break the network. Instead, the lesson that secrecy mattered sank deeper. He cut the number of people who touched sensitive matters and reminded ambitious men that attention brings cost. His influence extended to Rochester, Utica, and the Binghamton area through subordinates who kept to a compact. Local men ran local business, but the house rules came from Niagara Falls. In Rochester, a tough crew rose under veterans who owed their time to Buffalo. That city later fed its own ambitions. Yet during these years it paid its share and took direction. Utica's small but profitable games paid quietly. Endicott and Binghamton's vending, bars, and trucking interests answered to Barbara. And through Barbara, to the Undertaker. The arrangement minimized friction with other major powers. Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh each had their empires. The Great Lakes needed borders understood by all. Stefano kept lines open to those bosses and to New York City's Commission Forum, where old disputes could be cooled before anyone did something that damaged everyone's peace. Government files from this era show another theme. Narcotics. Heroin routes running through Montreal and other ports drew intense scrutiny, and agents tried to map the American end. Some of Stefano's associates on both sides of the river were arrested over the years on drug charges, and court records describe seizures, couriers, and coded calls. Investigators believed Buffalo's network offered a corridor. He rejected that accusation in private and public, insisting he forbade narcotics. The people working his rackets knew his posture on the subject. Even so, surveillance reports and informant stories kept linking the Niagara frontier to shipments that originated in Europe and moved through Canada. Because he avoided direct contact and spoke in person, the paper trail toward him rarely satisfied a court. The cloud of suspicion, however, never lifted. One autumn day in 1957 became the moment that pulled his name out of whispers and into bold type. A statewide detective had paid attention to unusual traffic headed toward a hilltop estate near a small town called Appalachian. New cars and out-of-town plates gathered at Joseph Barbara's property. Troopers set roadblocks. Inside the estate, men in tailored suits discussed business that ranged from leadership questions to the division of revenue. When the police closed in, guests scattered. Some ran across lawns. Others tried to drive away. Many were detained, fined for minor offenses, and released. The list of attendees stunned the public. Leaders from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, California, and beyond. Among those stopped and questioned was the Undertaker. He told officers he had stopped by to visit a convalescent friend and eat lunch. A Tioga County grand jury later indicted a group of attendees on conspiracy charges, arguing that they had gathered to engage in unlawful coordination. Courts rolled those charges back in the following years. Yet the damage was not in convictions. It was in exposure. Newspapers published names side by side and told readers that a national structure did exist. A Buffalo political figure, John C. Montana, who had long bridged civic life and the Italian community, was identified as a guest. The resulting uproar forced him to resign public office. The old practice of blending respectability and underworld influence took a blow that never fully healed. Appalachian pushed Stefano further into cautious habits. He limited travel, preferred meetings at safe houses, and let trusted envoys handle more contact with the outside world. He kept his chair in national deliberations, in part because longevity gives weight. He represented an area that touched international crossings, industrial cities, and a wide swath of upstate towns. He opposed reckless moves and insisted that any major shift, like opening new ventures in a town with an established boss, go through proper channels. That conservative stance earned him both respect and resentment. Younger men from flashier cities thought the old man too slow. He saw their impatience as a risk everyone else would pay for. The years after Appalachian brought more public scrutiny, senators and reporters chased a better picture of the structure hidden for decades. In 1963, a former soldier named Joseph Valakai testified in Washington and described the hierarchy he had seen. Families, bosses, and a commission. He named the man in Niagara Falls as the leading figure in Western New York. For locals who had only heard whispers, that confirmation landed hard. Police departments that had once treated him as a rumor now filed reports that spelled out his role in simple terms. He didn't grant interviews. He kept to the same schedule. Family, church, and business conducted out of a modest office where clients came for candles, caskets, and quiet words. The public image stayed steady, even as federal files thickened. The family's money kept flowing from sources that carried manageable risk. Gambling remained the engine. Sports betting adapted to the modern era, using phone lines that switched out regularly so warrants lagged behind. Agents raided rooms, captured slips, and hauled low-level clerks into court. Fines were paid, operations paused, and then phones rang again somewhere else. Loan operations maintained a steady base among small business owners. With union contacts, the family could nudge supply contracts or ensure a crew got hired on a site, which helped both sides. If a businessman balked at paying, persuasion began with a sit-down and only escalated if the person insisted on making it a problem. Even then, the aim was to end the disagreement without drama. A pattern repeated across years. A dispute started. Friends of both parties called for a meeting. A compromise amounted to a payment plan, a territory line, or a change in who got what night at a club. He expected order within his house. Captains kept crews in their lanes. If a street earner decided he could skip tribute, he lost his protection. If a mid-level operator grew arrogant, his tasks shifted to someone else for a while, a warning that didn't require shouting. The long run mattered more than 1 month's take. He moved pieces quietly in the background to prevent any single subordinate from becoming a rival power. Promotions often went to men with family ties or childhood bonds from the old town. They were less likely to turn impulsive or cooperate with authorities. This approach worked while the head could count on the simple authority of his name. Over time, though, it planted seeds of grumbling among men who believed the top kept too much for itself. Family ties that once looked like a strength carried their own trouble in the mid-1960s. His cousin in New York, Joseph Bonanno, began fighting to keep control of his own family against a group of rivals who claimed commission backing. When Bonanno vanished in 1964 and later said he had been abducted, he pointed fingers at enemies on the commission and hinted that his own blood had stood with them. Publicly, Stefano said little. In private, his position aligned with the consensus that Bonanno had overreached by seeking leverage that threatened the balance across other families. He supported the recognition of another leader in that family, which extended a dispute that turned Brooklyn blocks into chessboards. The conflict newspapers later called it the Banana War, dragged into the later 1960 seconds. The Undertaker's choice left scars that never closed. In a world where loyalty to hometown and kin mattered, this was a line drawn against a relative when business came first. Despite pressure, his reach into Canada remained a pillar. Canadian police grew sharper, politicians tougher, and newspapers bolder. Yet the alliance held because it had decades of practice. Hamilton's leadership respected the calm voice across the water, and Toronto's operators valued a stable partner who could negotiate with Detroit or New York without starting a storm. When a Canadian figure ran into legal trouble, replacements were ready. Routes shifted around port inspections. If a dockyard tightened, a trucking line became the route of choice. If a telephone switchboard drew attention, messages returned to couriers who could drive a short distance and speak in person. The old ways of limiting records proved useful against modern surveillance. Meanwhile, in Buffalo, he added small layers of legitimate investment. Real estate offered quiet returns. The funeral business provided clean ledgers. He avoided flashy ventures. You didn't see his name on a neon sign or a club's door. Some associates ran taverns, car lots, and vending companies. A few held stock in trucking outfits. These fronts provided both income and reasons to explain cash flow. They also knitted the underworld to everyday commerce. A tavern owner who owned a vending machine route might be a friend of the house. A wholesaler who leased trucks might understand that certain deliveries got priority. Those ties made it harder for authorities to draw a bright line between criminal enterprise and local business networks. The Undertaker's public image changed little. A slim, well-dressed man with careful manners walking into church, or a black car gliding to a curb outside his office. Neighborhood people greeted him with respect rooted in longest memory, not headlines. Reporters grew frustrated when nothing new could be photographed or quoted. Detectives sat on corners and watched men go in and out of a modest building, took plates, wrote reports, and waited for something big to break. Years slipped along that way. The old method, small meetings, clear rules, predictable envelopes continued to pay. Yet pressure from beyond Western New York kept increasing. Federal agencies improved their tools. Wiretaps sharpened. Informants entered rooms once considered airtight. Prosecutors learned to follow paper. Bank deposits that didn't match reported income safe deposit boxes rented under quiet names, real estate transactions with odd terms. In nearby Rochester, a restless faction pushed for more independence from Buffalo's control, reading the national climate and thinking it could carve out more for itself. Internally, some of Stefano's lieutenants looked at the distance between the top's comfort and their own shares and wondered if the old arrangement needed revisiting. The seeds of a storm lay dormant, waiting for a moment when a raid or a leak would expose not just operations but the unequal pile of cash at the summit. He remained convinced that caution would outlast investigation. He had seen waves come and go: temperance, prohibition, the Depression, wartime rationing, televised hearings, and a famous upstate raid. He had survived each by reducing noise and focusing on the slow drip of earnings that never made front pages. He expected the next wave to pass the same way. His rhythm did not change: a quiet office, trusted faces, envelopes counted, and old country patience. Only later would he learn that times had shifted just enough that old protections would no longer shield the top from the anger below or the new reach of the state. The first sign was a voice on a tape. Not a yell, not a confession, just ordinary talk caught by a hidden mic that a judge had allowed. The late 1,960 seconds brought new tools into quiet rooms. Phones clicked. Air vents held secrets. Old habits meet in person. Keep things short. Write nothing still helped. But now teams of agents stayed patient too. They built charts. They matched names to plates and voices to nicknames. They didn't chase a single charge. They tried to show a pattern. Across western New York, the rhythm that had protected Stefano for decades began to hum in a different key. Detectives wanted the gambling hub more than anything, because that was the engine. They listened for who called to check scores, who took numbers, where collections landed, which houses moved the envelopes. Taps touched phones used by runners. Microphones found their way into rooms where men felt at home. Agents used warrants to follow the paper that did exist: safe deposit box rentals, bank slips that didn't match declared income, and titles for property bought in the names of relatives. For a long time, none of it got close enough to him. Then one investigation finally reached the vault. In 1968, coordinated raids moved at once in Niagara Falls, Buffalo, and nearby towns. Doors opened under the knock of badges. Boxes at banks were drilled. Agents carried out cash wrapped in paper bands, lists with first names and numbers, and notes that looked like insurance policies but tracked debts. Among the boxes were those linked to Stefano's son, Peter, and a close relative who had long stood at his side. The sums were not small. Reporters found the words, hundreds of thousands, convenient. Photos showed briefcases and stacks that made a headline by themselves. The image stuck harder than any indictment did. The top had money stashed away, while the ranks were told to keep lean and quiet. Courts wrestled with the cases that spun off those raids. Defense lawyers attacked the warrants. Some evidence stayed out. Some charges faded. A few defendants pled to limited counts tied to gambling or false statements. As always, outcomes varied. Yet the legal victories did not fix the damage in-house. You could feel the change in how lieutenants talked when the door closed. They had kept up payments during hard months, had held down expenses to avoid drawing eyes, and had accepted smaller cuts when pressure rose. Seeing newspapers describe hidden boxloads of cash planted a question that does the most harm in any crew. Who exactly is looking out for whom? Rochester sharpened that question into a challenge. That city had long worked as a satellite under Buffalo's umbrella. In the 1,950 seconds its local leader, tied to the Niagara Falls house, did time after refusing to answer questions about the Appalachian meeting. As the 1,960 seconds wore on, his brother returned and pushed to consolidate the city under his hand, promising peace with Buffalo but asking to keep more revenue locally. Younger Rochester figures liked the idea. They wanted faster decisions and a leader who sat at their own cafe table instead of across the thruway. Stefano, careful by nature, saw risk in granting a freer hand. He had spent a lifetime making sure no single branch could stand as a second trunk. Discussions grew tense. Quietly, the Rochester table began to act more like its own center, still respectful on the surface, less obedient underneath. Across the border, the climate shifted too. Canadian police improved coordination and shared more with counterparts in the States. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police mapped drug routes that came in through Montreal and other ports, and they looked hard at how money and goods crossed the Great Lakes region. Hamilton's leadership under Giacomo Lupino remained steady, and Johnny Papaglia continued to run tough operations with an eye on profit over noise. They still took counsel from the Niagara Falls side, but the heat of the late 1960 seconds made everyone cautious. Messages that had once crossed bridges by phone returned to face-to-face talks in quiet houses. Trucks changed timing. Meeting places rotated. The cross-border alliance survived because it had learned to bend. Investigators elsewhere chipped away at the secrecy that had protected the national structure. In Brooklyn and Chicago, informants with long memories started to talk. Federal prosecutors tested a new tool. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970. Instead of chasing a single game room or one collection run, RICO let them allege a pattern, a web of bets, loans, protection payments, and union pressure that served a single enterprise. Cases took longer to build, but they reached higher. That law did not erase older habits at once, yet it signaled that the state was willing to learn patience from the people it hunted. Stefano read the shift and doubled down on routine. He had survived waves by narrowing contact and trusting a small circle. He saw no point in broad gestures. He let his son handle more business. Trusted relatives kept the Niagara Falls crew in line. A committee of senior captains handled day-with-day disputes in Buffalo so that fewer people had reason to come to him. He kept the funeral office as the symbol of quiet respect. He attended church, greeted neighbors, and avoided the kind of public scenes that had broken other men. To friends who visited, he remained the same. Calm. Slow. Certain that time would settle tempers. But tempers needed more than time after the vaults made news. People who felt slighted looked for new anchors. Some Buffalo earners aligned with Rochester's argument that the old balance had tilted too far toward Niagara Falls. Others believed the safest path lay in staying by the veteran who still held a chair when national matters came up. The split didn't produce a street war. That was never his way. It did produce cold rooms, thin smiles, and orders that took longer to obey. The power of a boss lives in people doing what he asks when he is not in the room. In these years, that power thinned. Law enforcement kept cutting at the financial route. Gambling phones were mapped and rolled up. Judges saw loan cases that described interest rates no bank could post. A few union figures tied to the building trades faced indictments that alleged coercion. A trucking line with friends in the house drew scrutiny for how contracts were assigned. The government's picture of Buffalo's underworld looked more complete than ever before. Captains in certain neighborhoods, couriers who drove set routes, collectors who visited bars on a schedule, and bankers who rented the right boxes to the right names. Even when charges didn't stick all the way to the top, the cost of defending the web and replacing arrested men ate at the bottom line. At the same time, the long fallout from his break with cousin Joseph Bonanno still colored relationships across the Northeast. Some old friends had never forgiven his stance during that crisis, when he sided with the wider table against blood. To those who cared most about hometown bonds, the choice looked cold. To him, it had been a question of preventing a chain reaction that would have pulled everybody into a fight they couldn't win. Years later, the wound made certain meetings harder. You can be right in your own mind and still pay a price in trust. He also faced the biology of time. By the early 1970 seconds, he was in his 80s. He moved slowly, kept shorter hours, and chose his appearances carefully. Nobody could deny his history. He had navigated from Sicilian courtyards to American factory towns, had built a border economy that spanned decades, and had sat as an elder when bosses from coast to coast sought a referee. Yet longevity in this world can be double-edged. Younger men stop believing that a person who came up under prohibition can feel the pace of a modern case. Some of his captains started to speak as if the best years were behind the house, a betrayal that hid behind polite expressions but showed in how they delayed or took liberties. One case after the 1968 raids underlined the new danger. Prosecutors aimed not at the Undertaker's public calm, but at the financial architecture of the family. They presented ledgers and betting slips, showed phone records that matched game days, played tapes where men used coded phrases that still meant only one thing when stacked against the rest of the record. A few defendants took pleas that traded prison time for the survival of their families. None of this put him in a cell. It did, however, pull reliable men off the street and fed the argument that the top had not shared risk fairly. The Canadian side weathered its own storms. Papalia faced arrests and did stints in American prisons during the decade, which forced adjustments across the river. Hamilton's bench stayed deep because Lupino had trained a structure that didn't depend on a single personality. Each time a leader went away for a period, another figure kept the tribute path open and the alliances intact. That resilience mattered to Stefano, who valued partners that could handle pressure without lurching. When he met with Hamilton's senior men in quiet houses, he stressed the same ideas he had lived by. Keep violence rare, share borders, and meet disagreements across a table before they become something that leaves scars. Rochester's drift grew into a posture nobody could ignore. The local boss there hosted his own gatherings in the late 1960s and early 1970s, presenting himself as the man who could deliver his city's peace. He sent messages that sounded respectful but firm. The town would manage its contracts and its games with more autonomy, but it would honor older ties if treated as an equal. To Stefano, there was no such balance. Equality inside a family meant two centers, which meant uncertainty, which always bred trouble. He instructed loyalists in Rochester to hold the line. That instruction worked only where his name still carried weight. Elsewhere, the new order took hold. Meanwhile, newspapers kept his story alive each time a grand jury called witnesses or a judge unsealed transcripts. Reporters reminded readers that the Undertaker had been stopped at Appalachian, named in Senate hearings, linked to Canadian partners, and now tied to money found behind bank vault doors. They couldn't hang a prison sentence on him, so they painted a portrait of quiet longevity. He refused interviews. Photographs showed him walking to church or stepping from a car. He looked steady, almost detached from the swirl of names that rose and fell around him. Inside the Niagara Falls office, the daily business of keeping peace continued. Disputes between bookies were settled with schedules that split weekends and holidays, so both could earn. A club that had fallen behind on payments got a plan that cut interest if the owners stayed current for 6 months. A contractor who had balked at a request to hire certain laborers received a visit from a union steward who explained the benefits of choosing from the correct hall. These were the levers that kept his world spinning. Predictable, profitable, and quiet. Every once in a while, someone ignored the rules and created a scene. When that happened, he reminded his men that the cost of noise was higher than the satisfaction of proving a point in public. He held to that doctrine even as the storm that began with drilled banks worked its way through every layer of his house. Some capos stayed loyal out of conviction. Some stayed because they saw no advantage in swapping steady leadership for the unknown. Some drifted in practice while offering polite words. By the early 1970s, the family functioned more like a loose federation anchored by history than the rigid structure it had been in the 1930s and 1940s. That shift did not erase his influence. It blunted it. Phone calls that once ended with a single yes or no now led to longer back-and-forths and compromises that kept the peace without reaffirming any one man's total control. Age also softened the edges in his home life. He spent more time with grandchildren, more afternoons with relatives, who had no interest in any of the things that had defined his public reputation. He remained formal in dress and bearing, still the man who made courtesy feel like a command. In private, he acknowledged the weariness that comes from decades of being the person who absorbs everyone else's problems. He had chosen that path and excelled. It still asked a price. The last years brought one more round of investigations. Agents followed the same map they always had: phone rooms, card games, union offices, bars where envelopes changed hands. Prosecutors layered new laws over old charges, hoping to flip the mid-level figures who knew enough to paint the top. Some in his circle talked to save themselves. Others kept their vow. The house lost a few operations and replaced them with modest ventures that wouldn't sit high on anyone's list. The returns were smaller, but steadier, which matched the old man's instincts. He had never chased flash. He didn't start in his 80s. Nothing about these years made him a myth. They made him what he had always been: a careful organizer of people and revenue, a guardian of lines on a map that ran along a river and across a border, a skeptic of hurry. He had adapted through eras because he distrusted chaos more than he loved dominance. The 1968 revelation about hidden cash hurt him not because it broke a law, but because it broke the perception that he measured fairly. Trust, once cracked, never seals perfectly again. He understood that lesson better than anyone. He still showed up, still listened, still pushed for order, and still believed that, given enough patience, he could hold a wide circle together. The clock, not a rival, would tell him whether he had guessed right. Winter settled over the river, and the city worked at its usual pace, while a quieter clock ticked inside offices where phones had no names on the doors. Time had worn grooves into every route from bar to back room. In those grooves, the old man still tried to steer. The early 1970 seconds brought a different kind of pressure, the slow kind that doesn't flash, but never lets up. New laws let prosecutors string together small steps into a single case. Agents waited longer, stacked months of surveillance, and brought grand jury's records instead of rumors. The habits that had saved him meeting in person, speaking little, using couriers remained useful, yet not perfect. Microphones hid better, wiretap orders arrived faster, and the men holding badges had learned to move with patience that once belonged only to his side of the table. Public attention rose and fell with headlines, but the real threat came from accountants and quiet investigators who followed money and schedules. A bookmaker's phone rang too often. A truck always reached the same warehouse just after closing. A union steward's nephew seemed to get every plum assignment. Patterns make cases. The state didn't need a single dramatic event anymore. It needed a story that made sense to a jury. Records from those years show steady raids on phones, clubs, and offices where bets were placed and debts recorded. Cases led to fines, short jail terms, or suspended sentences for lower figures. Defense lawyers fought search warrants and kept some evidence out. Even when the top stayed clear of court, the cost of replacing people and shifting operations showed up in the weekly count. Inside his own ranks, the wound from the bank vaults never closed. Those seized boxes, opened with drills while cameras flashed, had told a story his captains did not like. Money was always supposed to flow upward, but not to sit hidden while risks stayed on street corners and in rented rooms. For decades, faith in his judgment had kept the whole together. He took less than his reach would allow. He prized stability, and he acted like a custodian rather than a gambler. The sight of cash piled high under family names cracked that belief. A few voices that had stayed quiet for years now spoke up during closed-door talks. They wanted more autonomy, more say, and a share that reflected what they felt they carried. The old man saw danger in that shift. Two centers mean confusion. Confusion invites mistakes. Mistakes invite the state. His remedy stayed the same as it had always been. Focus on steady earners and reliable levers. Gambling remained the heart. Sports betting adjusted to televised games and better posted odds. Phones moved often, operators changed apartments, and the people answering kept lists that used codes simple enough to understand in the room and hard to explain in court. Runners still gathered numbers slips from taverns in the morning and delivered envelope totals at dusk. The house cut stayed modest enough to keep the action flowing, generous enough to satisfy crews that did the work. Dice and cards drew familiar crowds in tucked-away rooms. These rooms always carried risk. The risk was managed by knowing which doors to close for a week and which nights to leave dark. Loans kept money cycling. Small businesses, club owners, and gamblers who had fallen behind needed advances that banks would never grant. Interest. Rates were steep, payments weekly, with late fees that enforced discipline. Collectors preferred to resolve troubles in person, with patient talk. If a debtor tried to dodge, acquaintances reminded him that living without tension was worth more than pride in refusing to pick up a phone. Violence did not serve Magaddino's style. He wanted income that showed up every week, not stories that stayed in the paper for a month. He said as much without raising his voice. Earners make, the house takes its share, and the town stays calm. Labor influence gave the family a lever that outlasted raids on game rooms. In Buffalo, a laborer's local held the keys to many job sites. Produce markets, warehouses, and public projects needed crews cleared through the right office. Captains placed trusted men as stewards who set shifts, handled grievances, and could urge or slow a job. That power didn't rely on threats. It relied on paperwork and phone calls. The result was leverage when a contractor wanted a smooth week, or a city supervisor wanted peace at a site. Through this channel, the house touched trucking, demolition, concrete, and waste hauling. It was a form of influence that mixed easily with legitimate business and left fewer obvious marks. Across the river, the Canadian side matured into a parallel system that meshed with his design. Johnny Papalia returned from an American prison sentence in the late 1960 seconds and reasserted himself in Hamilton. He was tough and calculated, which matched the Undertaker's preference for order over noise. Giacomo Lupino remained a quiet patriarch in Hamilton's East End, the kind of figure who did not seek cameras and kept his word. In Montreal, the Cotroni organization handled its own affairs while keeping channels open along the corridor that ran past the Great Lakes. Agents tried to link the Niagara Passage to narcotics shipments that they tracked from overseas. Arrests hit couriers and middle managers over the years. Magaddino maintained that he forbade that trade. Records and informant statements left the question unsettled in the public record. What stayed certain was that the cross-border alliance kept gambling and cash-based ventures moving with a rhythm no border inspection could fully stop. Rochester remained the touchiest regional issue. For years, that city had accepted its role as a territory under the Buffalo umbrella. It paid its share and looked to the Niagara Falls office to resolve disputes. Then, in the second half of the 1960 seconds, local leadership tested the edges. Frank Valenti rose, presenting himself as a man who could deliver quiet streets, with the understanding that more of the city's money stayed home. He navigated between Buffalo and his own hungry lieutenants, a balancing act that pleased neither side. In early 1970 seconds, other figures, men who later became central in Rochester's internal battles, signaled that they would not be bound by rules set across the thruway. The Undertaker kept sending the same message back. Treat with respect, pay what is owed, and save everyone the cost of a feud. He could not erase ambition in a city of its own size and ego. He could only delay its consequences. Grand juries continued to call men close to him. Subpoenas landed at homes and offices. Several times his son faced charges tied to gambling and filings that did not match bank movements. Defense teams argued the familiar points: no direct link to the elder, flawed warrants, overreach by investigators. Outcomes were mixed: some dismissals, some probation, some fines, but each case pulled attention and money. The old man stayed out of prison, a fact that frustrated agents who had tracked his habits for years. He presented himself in public as a businessman with a steady schedule. He kept his suits conservative, his speech measured, his world small. Court documents show how often he was named as a person of interest, yet left without a case that could carry a jury past reasonable doubt. Taxmen came with their own angle. They looked at declared income, real estate, and ownership in small companies that handled vending machines, coin-operated amusements, and supply routes. They asked how someone could live so well on paper so thin. The answer sat in cash businesses that any neighborhood accepted as normal. Taverns, restaurants, and small wholesalers moved money in ways that didn't always line up with ledger entries. Ownership sat behind relatives, friends, and companies with bland names. Each thread by itself looked weak. Woven together, the threads formed a safety net that held the family up through raids and arrests that hit other cities harder. Even with that net, time made itself felt. The boss walked more slowly. He took longer pauses in conversations and trusted lieutenants to carry more talk. He still greeted clergy at church doors and neighbors in the street. He attended wakes with the same calm nods that had built his image over years. He kept to the funeral home office where clients arrived for sensible reasons that had nothing to do with the life. He preferred dinners at home, early nights, and long mornings reading the local paper. People who had known him since the 1920 seconds said he had not changed, only slowed. He still favored predictability over impulse, routine over flair. Behind the image, the structure continued to flex. He set up a committee of senior captains to handle disputes before they reached his desk. This panel kept bookmaking lines from overlapping, eased quarrels over loan accounts, and settled questions about who claimed which tavern or which night at a club. It also served another purpose. It made sure no single lieutenant became essential enough to claim more than his slot. That had always been his way, and it helped prevent a second center of power. Yet that same law of balance made some subordinates feel permanently capped. They had spent years taking risks and watching the top keep a tight grip on the largest stream. After 1968, resentment had names and addresses. The Undertaker knew who grumbled. He gave them just enough to keep the circle intact, and no more. Law enforcement began experimenting with long conspiracy counts that sketched a portrait of the family as an enterprise with common purpose and methods. They described a pattern of illegal gambling, collections, and labor coercion. Defense counsel attacked the idea that a set of local cases could depict a single criminal organization without direct orders on tape. Judges split on how far to let the theory stretch. Prosecutors kept filing. Some of the younger men faced lengthy counts that brought real time. A few became witnesses. Their statements painted routines that matched what agents had watched, right down to which day of the week collection routes ran. Those stories said less about the old man's words than about the culture he set rules, boundaries, and the way trouble got cooled. Even when a witness had never taken a call from the boss, he could describe the structure that kept the envelopes moving. Nothing about those years looked like the blast of a war. They looked like erosion. The base still held, but the edges crumbled. Operations that had once been handled by the same faces now rotated to new ones because old names had gone away or retired under pressure. Across the border, Hamilton's leadership remained solid, though it too absorbed the cost of modern policing. Papalia's crews adapted, Lupino's people kept the peace, and meetings continued in unobtrusive houses where nobody took notes. The river kept its role as both barrier and bridge. Each side relied on the other's consistency. That consistency, more than any one figure's charisma, was the glue. In July 1974, the clock ran out. After a long life that spanned 2 continents, 2 languages, and more than half a century of clandestine work, Stefano Magaddino died in Niagara Falls at 83. The cause was a heart attack. There were no sirens, no lady-night chases, no public scene. Word spread by phone and through quiet visits. A service drew family, neighbors, and men who had taken his calls for decades. Reporters stood on sidewalks and wrote about a figure who had outlasted prohibition, televised hearings, and a famous upstate raid. They struggled to summarize a career built on the absence of public acts. They listed the ways investigators had tied him to bootlegging, gambling, loans, union pressure, and cross-border arrangements. They noted that, despite decades of suspicion, he had avoided the prison terms that had ended other careers. The portrait that emerged was of a man who treated crime as administration. Keep accounts, honor schedules, calm disputes, and never show more than you must. The shock after his passing was less about surprise and more about the practical question of succession. His son had faced charges and scrutiny, and the anger sparked by the vaults still lingered. A panel of senior hands stepped in, seeking to keep routines steady and avoid inviting rivals to test the house. In Buffalo, established earners expected continuity and protection. In Niagara Falls, loyalists wanted their historic weight respected. Across the river, Hamilton's veterans looked for a partner as reliable as the Undertaker had been. The National Forum watched with interest. Nobody wanted a fight on a border that touched many interests. In the short run, the family chose caution. Nobody tried to turn a funeral into a proclamation. The message inside the house was that nothing would change quickly. History judged him by what endured. He had professionalized illegal markets in Western New York, connecting them to partners who understood that quiet revenue beats explosive headlines. He had used union influence to steer jobs and contracts without broad public scandal. He had kept the most volatile aspirants out of his circle and the most reckless ventures at arm's length. He had also held power so tightly that a discovery in 1968 cracked the trust that made his system work. He denied involvement in narcotics, while evidence tied people around him to that world. The record left that dispute unresolved. He never claimed reform. He simply did his work with a devotion to routine that turned an underworld into a set of municipalized processes. His story ended without the drama that often closes lives in that world. That was fitting. He had always preferred a steady night to a spectacular morning paper. He left a network that would soon face splits it had delayed for years. Rochester's tensions would boil over. Buffalo's labor rackets would draw deeper federal attention. Canadian allies would navigate their own generational shift. All of that sat beyond his last day. What he left behind was a model. Use patience, invest in structure, lean on predictability, and avoid the temptation to chase every dollar. It kept him in place longer than most. It brought him respect from people who disliked what he did, but admired how he did it. And it taught everyone who studied his career that power maintained by quiet habits can shape a region as surely as laws on the books or elections at City Hall. Snow stayed longer that year, clinging to roofs along the gorge, as if the season itself didn't want to move on from a man who had shaped the town's hidden rhythm. After the funeral, the city settled into a silence that felt heavier than usual. Phone numbers that always connected now paused. People who had built their week around a Monday envelope and a Friday sit-down adjusted their watches and waited to see which door to knock on. The first months looked calm because everyone who mattered wanted them to. Crews still collected wagers, runners still carried slips to apartments where lines were answered in short phrases, and union stewards still checked off names with a pencil that could change a list in a second. The difference sat in the pauses between calls. Decisions that one voice would have made had to pass through more than one room. The family did not crown a successor in public. A small circle of senior hands shared tasks that the boss had carried alone for years. They focused on keeping the map intact. Niagara Falls and its suburbs, the old Buffalo wards, the towns that lined the river, the cross-border ties that made everything else easier. That committee steered gambling, loans, vending, and labor contacts with the same ideas he had taught: predictability, boundaries, peace over noise. People outside the inner circle called it an adjustment. Inside the house, it felt like constant triage. The undertaker had blended caution and authority so completely that taking his name off the letterhead changed more than anyone admitted. You could see his imprint in how the business still avoided flashes. The bookmaking lines kept to steady percentages. Operators turned over ledgers often and used clean apartments instead of backroom offices tied to a name. If a bet grew too large, a call split it over 2 books. The numbers game stayed popular with people who liked a small wager and a morning ritual. Shopkeepers who hosted action knew exactly when to expect pickups and when to let the back door stay locked. Dice and card rooms kept hours that didn't match police shift change. None of this looked dramatic. That was the point. In a city where factories had shuttered and people worried about layoffs, the demand for distraction and shorter-term credit didn't vanish. His system fit that demand because it had grown with it. Labor influence remained the most durable lever he had left behind. In Buffalo, the laborers local that had long been a nerve center still controlled, who poured concrete, who handled demolition, who drove trucks out of warehouses. The men who wore those badges knew which clubhouse to visit if they wanted to move up the list. Contractors who had projects on tight deadlines understood the value of having a steward who returned calls quickly and kept grievances from turning into stoppages. This form of power felt almost ordinary, tangled as it was with civic life, roadwork, and public bids. Investigators looking for bright lines found blurred edges instead. Dues collected by the book, contracts awarded by committees, and only whispers tying those processes back to a handful of quiet figures who kept the peace. Across the river, his death did not erase the channels he had dug across decades. Hamilton's leadership remained intact. Giacomo Lupino still acted as a calm anchor, and Johnny Papalia kept a tight grip on operations that ranged from gambling to contract enforcement in his city's neighborhoods. Meetings continued in living rooms on both sides of the border, with tea poured, small talk made, and plans agreed upon in careful phrases. If a route needed to change because a checkpoint grew attentive, it changed. If a courier drew attention, another took his place. Canadian police had improved their coordination and their patience, and the press north of the line had grown bolder. The alliance adjusted by lowering its profile even further. If a phone once carried a message, a short drive now did. If a truck carried paper, a trunk carried cash. Law enforcement in the States did not relax after a funeral. The years before had taught agencies that steady work could uncover a structure that never announced itself. Agents followed the same pattern. Taps on rooms where sports lines were posted. Quiet cameras on doors that saw too many familiar faces. Subpoenas for bank records that looked routine until you stacked them over months. Grand juries heard about gambling phones, cash loans, collection routes, and union stewards whose calls seemed to carry extra weight. The aim had shifted since the days when one dramatic charge was all a prosecutor hoped for. Now prosecutors built mosaics. They tried to show a jury not a single moment, but a culture. How disputes were resolved, how profits moved, who had the final say when a tie had to be broken. It was the approach best suited to a regime built on habit. Those files always circled back to the Undertaker's prime years, because that was where the rules had been written. Reports described how, during Prohibition, the Niagara frontier had become a highway of barrels and cases, passed hand to hand from farms and lakeside docks to ice houses and garage bays. They summarized the post-Prohibition pivot to gambling and loans, the careful cultivation of local politicians who preferred order over public crusades, and the later expansion into Union Hall influence that placed shop stewards on every site that mattered. They quoted witnesses who said that, in sit-downs, he never raised his voice, and that people left a meeting with him understanding that their business would live if they followed the map. They repeated the phrases investigators had used for years: quiet, patient, methodical. The same words that had once frustrated a case now served as the frame around a finished portrait. One question that came up often in those years concerned narcotics. Agents in both countries had spent the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds tracing shipments from sources overseas through Montreal and other ports into the United States. In those files, couriers, brokers, and street-level dealers appeared and disappeared like figures on a chalkboard. The allegation that the Buffalo-Niagara corridor served as a passage ran through reports across decades. Associates on both sides of the border faced charges tied to that trade. Some served time. The Undertaker maintained throughout his life that he forbade it. His defenders repeated that denial. The public record never produced a courtroom moment that proved a personal role at the top. That absence did not erase the belief among agents that the corridor his alliances sustained had been used by people who sought profit in drugs. The historical picture, while careful to separate allegations from verdicts, keeps that debate alive because both sides left traces. Another recurring subject involved politics. For a period, a prominent civic figure from Buffalo's Italian community, respected as a businessman and a connector of neighborhoods to City Hall, had been close to him. That man's presence at the upstate gathering that police interrupted in the late 1,950 seconds wrecked his public career and showed how civic and underworld networks had overlapped under the old order. It also made the Undertaker even more cautious about mixing spheres. He had always preferred to keep the world of envelopes and sit-downs separate from the world of ribbon cuttings. After that exposure, the separation became nearly absolute. He sent emissaries when city matters needed input and avoided scenes that produced photographs. The lesson that visibility equals risk never left him. Inside his own house, the structure he built taught men to value routine over spectacle. Captains ran neighborhoods, submits returned to the top, and changes came slowly. The benefits were clear: fewer explosions, more predictability, a community that often felt safer than headlines elsewhere suggested. The cost was less obvious until late in his tenure. By preventing anyone below from growing too strong, he protected the house from internal threats. He also discouraged energetic men who wanted to grow operations or modernize tactics. That tension showed itself in the late 1,960 seconds and early 1,970 seconds and persisted after his death. Some favored decentralization. Others wanted to keep a single hand on the wheel. That argument is not unique to his family. It runs through every long-lived organization, legal or illegal, that has to balance control with adaptation. Look closely at the border era that defined him, and you see a pattern of choices that avoided the spotlight. He didn't seek monopoly on visible trades that caused public outcry. He preferred markets that the community tolerated betting in moderation, credit when banks said no, union influence that kept jobs moving. He kept channels open to other regional leaders to resolve disputes quietly. When trouble came in the form of national attention televised hearings, sensational raids, his answer was never a counter-punch. It was a retreat into deeper quiet. That strategy carried him through crises that ended other careers. It also meant that, when a real rupture did arrive in the form of those bank vaults opened by authorities, he wasn't prepared to rebuild trust out loud. He had built a system where trust lived in habits and never in speeches. People often asked, after he was gone, how to measure his legacy. One measure sits in duration. He guided a regional organization for nearly 50 years, longer than many mayors, governors, and business leaders hold power. Another sits in geography. He took a mid-sized American city, and tied its gray markets to an international border, giving his district a significance larger than its population would suggest. Another sits in method. He ran crime like a set of municipal services, predictable schedules, assigned routes, clear channels for appeals. That bureaucratic approach, combined with personal reserve, made his empire less visible and more resilient than flashier models in other cities. A final measure sits in contradiction. He avoided courthouse defeats that sent other bosses to prison. Yet he could not avoid a loss of confidence inside his house after the 1968 seizures. He kept faith with order and patience. Yet the same patience sometimes looked like delay to younger men who wanted to change the speed of everything. There is also the matter of his hometown. He never lost the culture of Castellammare del Golfo, the preference for elders settling disputes, the pride in family, the understanding that status comes from reliability more than noise. That culture gave him allies across the Northeast when the Castellammarese War ended and a new national structure took shape. It also placed him on one side in later conflicts that cut across lines of blood and business. His choice during the crisis that engulfed his cousin's family in the 1960 seconds is a prime example. He sided with the broader table against a relative whose ambitions, in his view, threatened everyone's balance. That decision fit his philosophy and cost him friendships that mattered beyond business. His death froze a life's worth of habits into a ledger that others would interpret for decades. Historians and reporters list the crimes tied to his house: bootlegging during Prohibition, later gambling across neighborhoods and towns, loans at rates that pressed debtors, union manipulation that steered contracts and staffing, extortionate pressure that encouraged cooperation, and, in the eyes of investigators if not established by courts in his own hand, a corridor that served narcotics traffickers working through Canada. They describe how he kept a funeral home as a respectable front, cultivated clergy and community leaders, and donated prudently. They note the rare occasions when public pressure pushed him onto the record, and the almost total lack of quotes that reveal the man. They record that, despite decades of inquiries, he never served the long prison terms that claimed contemporaries in other cities. All those lines are drawn in careful language because the record requires careful language. The absence of convictions does not erase a network that law enforcement mapped in detail. The detail doesn't turn every allegation into a verdict. His career sits at that intersection. Walk the streets he controlled, even years later, and you still hear his name in a particular tone. Not shouted, not whispered, but said with a kind of practiced respect. People remember the way disputes subsided after a phone call, the way certain holidays were split between bookmakers to keep peace, the way club owners understood that steady payments kept doors open. They recall that he disliked drama so much that, in the end, his leaving caused none. No caravan of cars tearing across town. No last statement, just a service, a closed office, and a network that kept moving under new hands. The border keeps teaching his lesson. It looks solid on a map, a line between flags. In practice, it's a living place where families visit, where workers commute, where cash and goods cross back and forth with legitimate reasons. He learned to hide within that regular motion. He made illegal money look like the background noise of a region that had reasons to move at all hours. That skill, more than any single crime, explains his longevity. It also explains why, decades later, people still study his methods when they talk about how hidden economies survive. So much of his life happened in rooms no camera saw that you have to rely on patterns to understand him. The slow widening of influence from a funeral parlor, the set of meetings that followed each disturbance, the habit of letting someone else take a headline while he moved the pieces behind a curtain. You hear the river and the falls and the hum of a city that learned his schedule without ever seeing it written down. When you step back, you see a portrait built less of moments than of texture, with crimes noted in records, alliances sketched by investigators, and outcomes that reflect one person's devotion to predictability. He didn't chase fame, and he didn't leave a manifesto. He left a map between two countries and a set of rules that turned shadows into routines. In the years after he was gone, the story people told about him kept circling back to the same quiet choices. So to fill the picture, you have to return to rooms and roads that set his pattern long before national headlines learned his name. As a young immigrant walking Brooklyn streets in the 1910 seconds, he stepped into a web already strung by men from his hometown, Castellammare del Golfo. They kept close, ate at the same tables, pooled favors, and treated trust as currency. Among them were names that later defined an era. Maranzano, with his scholar's posture and iron will, Bonventre, with a gift for calming tempers, and a younger cousin, Joseph Bonanno, who would someday lead in New York. The boy from the Sicilian coast learned by carrying messages and keeping his mouth shut. He understood quickly that in America, opportunity came to patient men who avoided noise. That patience proved vital when a shadow followed him from the old country. Sicilian authorities, tying his circle to a 1,913 killing, tried to pull him back across the sea. He never returned to stand in a courtroom there. In America, he insisted on his innocence and focused on building a life that kept him far from reporters. The legal cloud in Italy never touched a U.S. jury box, but it shaped his posture toward exposure for the rest of his days. He let the rumor travel and kept moving. Prohibition turned patience into profit for men who knew geography. The Niagara frontier offered everything a planner could want. Bridges at Buffalo and Niagara Falls, side roads that cut through farmland, rail sidings, and a river whose currents hid small craft on moonless nights. Ontario's distilleries kept their licenses. American law made their product contraband once it crossed. Money arrived from speakeasies and clubs all the way to the Midwest. Coordinating those streams called for a temperament like his. He didn't drive boats or crawl through culverts. He set rules. Bring loads on nights when enforcement thinned. Use safe garages and barns known to trusted families. If a checkpoint grew alert, switch routes. If a crew got greedy and grabbed more than its share, replace them before resentment turned into a feud. That era also introduced him to the benefits of legitimate fronts. A funeral home gave him a reason to keep odd hours and meet anyone without raising eyebrows. He wore a dark suit because the job required it, and the suit doubled as a shield. If a city official stopped by, the pretext was always decent. Families in grief don't point cameras. Neighbors don't ask questions when they see a hearse out front. The Undertaker image formed early, not as theater but as a practical choice that let him blend in while others flashed signs that attracted raids. Buffalo's Italian colony already had leaders before he arrived. Angelo Palmieri, a figure with roots and reach, held sway for a time. When Palmieri died in 1926, a vacancy opened at the top. The man from Castellamare didn't campaign. He put people in places that mattered. Near the bridges, in ward clubs, at union halls, and inside taverns where bookies took lines. Bit by bit, men from older crews came to him to settle disputes. He listened, summed the costs of a feud, and named a solution that saved everyone face. That skill adjudication without theatrics helped him turn a bootleg corridor into a permanent seat. When the Castellamarese War consumed New York City at the turn of the 1930 seconds, he stood with his own. Masseria's camp pressed for control. The Castellamarese faction resisted. The fight ended with a new order. Territory defined, a national forum to resolve clashes, and an understanding that endless feuds killed profits. The Niagara boss gained recognition inside that new framework. He did not chase the title that some men loved. He accepted a chair. From it, he argued for borders and moderation. In that world, restraint passed for wisdom because it saved money and lives. After repeal, he shifted from cases of whiskey to ledgers filled with bets and loan accounts. The numbers racket thrived because it felt like a neighborhood habit. Choose digits in the morning, check them at night. Bookmakers took wagers on baseball, boxing, and later, football. Operators kept phones moving so a warrant served on Monday landed at a deadline by Wednesday. Dice and card rooms ran in places where the rent was low and the neighbors mind their business. The house took its cut and paid to keep the peace. The model worked because he treated gambling like a public utility. Consistent rates, polite collectors, and a low tolerance for drama. Loans at tough interest satisfied a need banks refused. Bar owners kept the lights on with cash that came in minutes, not weeks. Contractors covered payrolls when a job ran long. Gamblers who ran bad luck tried to climb out. Collectors used reminders, meetings, and payment schedules to keep accounts current. The pressure in that world often ended with a handshake and a warning, not a spectacle. That kept headlines away and revenue flowing. The most durable lever he set in motion sat in organized labor, especially in Buffalo's construction trades. Over time, influence around a laborer's local widely reported as Local 210 let his camp steer who worked where. Stewards on a site could ease tension or spark it. A contractor who asked for a favor knew where to call. A city figure who wanted a road project finished on time understood that the right list at the Union Hall mattered as much as the right truck on the site. Investigators later used the Hobbs Act, which targets extortion affecting commerce, to probe such influence. During his tenure, the power often lived in paperwork and phone calls rather than overt threats, which made it harder to attack. Cross-border ties matured into a second spine for his organization. Hamilton's Giacomo Lupino became a partner in patience, and Johnny Papalia, tough and controlled, enforced arrangements in his city that complemented Niagara Falls. Toronto had its own balance of groups. Montreal's underworld, led for long stretches by the Catroni camp, sat at the far end of a corridor that fed rumors and cases about drugs. Agents on both sides mapped heroin routes across the Atlantic, through Quebec, and into the States. Arrests hit couriers and middle managers. Informants pointed at corridors, cars, and phone numbers. The Undertaker's public line stayed fixed. He forbade narcotics. Files preserved a mismatch that never closed his denial versus the persistence of roots that used territory his alliances had stabilized. He moved through decades by practicing institutional memory. He remembered which detective valued a quiet district over big arrests, which judge hated shabby warrants, which reporter enjoyed a photo more than a footnote. He taught his own house to anticipate city budgets, politics, and media cycles. When the Kefauver hearings turned organized crime into television, he declined to play a character. Subpoenaed associates answered with their rights or vague recollections. Viewers learned terms that had lived in whispers. He learned to shrink his circle again. Appalachian broke the illusion that leaders moved alone. It wasn't the charges that stung those crumbled in court, it was the list. Names from coast to coast caught on a country road because a trooper named Edgar Croswell noticed too many new cars at a quiet house. The event stripped public cover from a generation of civic go-betweens. In Buffalo, a respected businessman and political figure, John C. Montana, saw a career collapse. The Undertaker's reaction was predictable. He retreated deeper into private rooms and sent envoys when something had to be said in public. The 1,960 seconds brought a pair of storms he couldn't fully control. One came from inside the extended clan, when cousin Joseph Bonanno's bid to reshape power in New York met the commission's resistance. The Niagara boss sided with the wider table. He believed Bonanno's push threatened system-wide balance. The choice, reasonable to him, read as betrayal to some who prized blood ties. The wound lingered for years. The second storm came from law enforcement's increasingly sophisticated methods. Title III of the 1968 federal law allowed wiretaps with strong safeguards that made evidence sturdier. RICO, passed in 1970, let prosecutors tell juries a story of a pattern rather than a single event. Those tools didn't put him behind bars, but they turned every room into a place where words could travel further than anyone in that world liked. Then came the discovery that did more damage at home than any indictment. Drilled bank vaults that revealed cash and papers linked to his son and close kin. The number itself mattered less than the symbol. Men who had risked arrest to keep the phones running and the halls friendly saw that wealth pooled at the very top while they tightened belts during pressure. Trust wobbled. The old man tried to steady it with the same medicine he had always used: routine, patience, and tempered rewards. For some, the dose no longer worked. Rochester grew more autonomous under Frank Valenti and others who wanted more local control. Buffalo captains paused before they obeyed. Canada stayed loyal because continuity made money, but even there, prudence deepened. He kept his workday unchanged as long as his health allowed. Mornings in a modest office, meetings at homes where curtains stayed drawn, Sundays at church. Envelopes counted by people who had handled them for years. He remained a commission elder, whose conservative voice still held weight because it had seen cycles rise and fall. He still argued for borders, agreements, and calm. He still disliked hubris that had pushed younger men in other cities into wars they couldn't win. Investigations during his final years leaned into conspiracy counts that depicted his house as a long-standing enterprise. Prosecutors stacked betting slips, phone logs, bank records, and coded chatter to draw a picture. Defense counsel picked at the edges and asked juries to separate rumor from proof. Results were mixed, as they had been for decades. He emerged each time without a long sentence, which deepened the frustration inside agencies that had mapped his world with care. The absence of a dramatic courtroom finale doesn't erase the record that shows his hand on bootlegging, gambling, loan operations, union pressure, and regional coordination that stretched from small New York towns to Canadian cities. It means only that he excelled at keeping distance between himself and the acts his structure made possible. The portrait that survives shows a manager rather than a showman. He structured illegal markets to look boring because boring lasts. He built redundancy into the networks, so a raid on one room didn't close a district. He used kinship as glue, but not as an absolute. When blood and business parted, he chose the side that kept the map intact. He stayed polite because it disarmed people. He donated quietly because it made him look like every other small businessman in a town that prized humility. He set meetings where participants left with a workable plan, even if none of them got exactly what they wanted. He removed people who preferred heat to profit. Those choices, repeated over decades, made him an institution. Measure the crimes tied to his model, and the list spans eras. Prohibition made him a coordinator of contraband liquor moving across water and bridges. Repeal shifted his focus to games run by phones and runners, to loans priced high because demand was higher, to extortion that looked like persuasion until someone refused to play along, and to union manipulation that moved men and money without shouting. Some subordinates and partners stepped into narcotics despite his claimed ban, and authorities traced routes through territory his alliances protected. He sat on a national council that smoothed or sanctioned many of these activities across regions. He didn't invent the underworld, he standardized it. The personal details stay faint because he wanted them that way. He married, raised children, and kept his household private. He dressed neatly and moved with the dignity expected of a man in his public trade. He valued music at weddings, candles at church, and good suits that didn't shout. In the quiet of his last years, he spent more time with grandchildren and old friends who remembered who he was before the world attached titles to him. People close to him described someone who never wasted words and rarely backtracked once he settled on a judgment. When his heart stopped in 1974, Niagara Falls didn't change shape, but something in its rhythm shifted. The house he had built tried to keep his calendar without his hand on the clock. Canada kept its side steady because everybody there understood the cost of disorder. Buffalo continued to balance union pull with public projects. Rochester slid toward a split that would flare in the decade after he was gone. Prosecutors kept pushing cases that relied on the blueprints he had left. Reporters wrote obituaries that struggled to pin adjectives on a man who had made himself a shadow with a schedule. If you walk past the bridges at dusk, you can still imagine the arrangement he favored. Borders respected, envelopes counted, disagreements handled across a table, and a city allowed to sleep under the hum of machines and the roar of water. His life teaches that power can look like quiet if it lasts long enough. It also teaches that quiet isn't the same as clean. He ran rackets as if they were bureaucracies, and left behind a ledger of harms that the people who paid the vig or lost the contract felt in small daily ways. The law never wrote a long sentence with his name on it, but the record wrote a long story about a man who turned patience into influence, and influence into a system that spanned decades, neighborhoods, and a river that hides every sound but its own. Archives filled with clippings and memos couldn't capture the sound of his voice, so people who knew him described a tone more than words: slow, even, and final. Once he'd decided, they said he treated meetings like a judge treats a docket. One case at a time, no drama, conclusions that left both sides with enough to live on. That manner shaped not just Buffalo and Niagara Falls, but the way other cities thought about keeping peace. He didn't reach for every dollar. He built lanes and kept traffic in them. The lanes started with liquor in the 1,920 seconds, when barges, skiffs, and trucks shuttled cases from Canadian warehouses to barns on the American side. Crews used farm roads, closed up ice houses, and garages where neighbors minded their business. He made sure the same men didn't run the same route twice in a row. If a bridge post seemed alert, loads moved upriver at night. If a deputy took an interest in a country lane, the lane rested a month. You see the pattern. No heroics, just edits to a calendar, When repeal came, he didn't cling to a dying trade. He turned to games that felt like part of the neighborhood numbers in the morning. Sports lines by phone, cards and dice in low rooms. Runners wore plain clothes and walked like people with errands, not like people with secrets. Labor became his quietest tool. A laborer's local in Buffalo gave him a way to touch jobs without flags or headlines. Stewards wrote schedules, sorted disputes, and set the tone on sites. A contractor who wanted a smooth week learned to make the right call. A city planner who wanted a project to finish on time learned which office could ease a snag. Investigators later pointed to patterns favored firms, lists that moved faster for some than others, contracts that seemed to lean and called it coercion. Inside the system, it looked like efficiency with a price. He learned that such influence survives because it uses forms in meetings, not shouting. The Hobbs Act gave prosecutors a lane to call it extortion when they could show commerce was pinched, but getting from suspicion to a clean verdict proved harder when the pressure lived in polite conversations. He kept a foothold in every business that fit cash and discretion. Jukebox and vending routes gave collectors a reason to visit taverns and diners without raising questions. Cigarette taxes on each side of the border didn't match, which made small gray markets tempting. Crates moved quietly where customs lines blurred into neighborhoods. A few men handled truck consignments that fell off routes and needed redistributing. None of these trades showed up on a marquee. That was the point. Cash went out, cash came back, and nobody sent a receipt. The public learned his name in waves. The Kefauver hearings put Syndicate on television, and reporters in Buffalo wrote about him as the local face of a national story. He ignored cameras. Appalachian did the most damage, not with a conviction, but with a guest list. Seeing him leave Joseph Barber's property alongside leaders from New York, New Jersey, the Midwest, and the coast made plain that he wasn't just an upstate figure. He stood among the senior voices in a structure that settled disputes across regions. Valakai's testimony a few years later pinned titles on that structure and called it by the name insiders used. In that portrait, the man in Niagara Falls sat as a chair who urged restraint, borders, and order. Commission politics always carried risk. After the 1931 reorganization, he had dealt with Luciano's push for businesslike rules, then watched power shift as Genovese tried to dominate the table, then watched again as Gambino and Lucchese formed alliances that redrew influence in New York. Through those turns, he chose predictability over bold moves. When his cousin Joseph Bonanno sought to tilt the balance in the 1,960 seconds, he stood with the consensus that said, no one family's ambition could be allowed to pull everyone into a fight. Memoirs and investigative books later accused him of doing more than disagreeing, of leaning against his own blood at crucial moments. He never explained his side in public. The result is the image that stayed, a man who would choose the rules over kin if that kept the map from burning. Narcotics turned into the longest-running argument in his biography. Agents on both sides of the border drew charts showing heroin routes from Europe to the street, Lawrence, into Montreal, and then down into the States, along roads that also carried gambling money and gray market goods. Arrests hit couriers and mid-level brokers in Canada and New York. Informants described meetings, coded calls, and cars that crossed bridges at odd hours. He maintained that he banned that trade. Supporters pointed to his preference for businesses that didn't scorch communities. Skeptics pointed to arrests around him and set a corridor that busy doesn't stay pure by accident. Courts never disgorged a record that put narcotics in his hands. Histories keep the tension because the people who wrote those reports had reasonable suspicions, and the man at the center left no confession to settle the matter. The safety deposit seizures in 1968 tore into something stronger than any indictment could reach. The bond between the top and the men below, cash in boxes tied to his son and a close relative, made the rank and file feel like pack animals pulling a wagon they'd never ride. Discontent deepened in Buffalo and in Rochester, where Frank Valenti had pitched local autonomy as a sensible modernization. The old man saw risk in any plan that created two centers. He tried to hold the line through committees that spread authority just enough to calm nerves. The fix worked on paper. In rooms where people counted their take, the image of those boxes sat heavier than any memo. Canadian allies kept continuity alive. In Hamilton, Giacomo Lupino's calm presence gave the partnership a mirror image across the water. Johnny Papalia enforced discipline without fanfare. and returned from prison terms with his local authority intact. Toronto ran its own balances, tipping toward whoever promised peace. Montreal's figures, busy with their own wars and pressures, still left space for the Lake Corridor to function. Meetings moved to smaller houses, phones grew more temporary, and messages went back to being carried in cars. The alliance slowed when the press hounded, then resumed at a lower hum. Law enforcement adapted. Title III, wiretaps, with stricter procedures, made tapes more likely to hold in court. RICO allowed prosecutors to describe a pattern, rather than sell a jury on a one-off event. Tax investigators cross-checked deposits, property deeds, and business filings with declared income. The goal wasn't a single flashy bust. It was to show that gambling rooms, loan accounts, and union influence were branches of one enterprise. In Buffalo's orbit, outcomes still looked mixed. Bookies paid fines, collectors took short stints, a steward or two lost a post, and mid-level figures faced longer counts. The old man remained on the edge of those cases, named, cited, pointed at, but not carried off. To agents, that made him the symbol of the problem. The person who built distance into the machine. He used that distance to manage smaller markets that rarely drew headlines. Utica's games paid quietly. Syracuse saw visitors when a new club needed guidelines. The Binghamton area, long tied to Barbara, continued to host meetings when a retreat from city noise made sense. In each place, the tone matched his style. No street displays, no provocation, a preference for older proprietors who understood how to run a room without inviting raids. The preference for old ways had a cost. Younger earners in the late 1960s saw change coming: the shift to faster communication, the need to diversify, and felt handcuffed. He believed that speed turned into sloppiness, and sloppiness turned into cases. His public life never changed. He attended church, sent wreaths, shook hands at wakes, and kept the funeral parlor as a place where anyone could visit for ordinary reasons. He donated to causes that helped the neighborhood. He spoke with politicians only through trusted go-betweens. He never let vanity draw him into a photograph that could live in a file forever. When reporters approached, he declined with courtesy that felt like a closed door. When illness finally caught him in 1974, he left no last statement, no dramatic settlement of questions. He left routines and a blueprint. Afterward, the family used a panel to manage disputes, tried to hold the Buffalo labor connection together, and leaned on Canadian continuity. Rochester drifted into its own troubles that would later turn loud, the kind of noise he'd spent a life avoiding. Investigators kept filing cases built from the architecture he had designed. New names rose, but the map still bore his pencil marks. Judging his legacy means sitting with contradictions. He ran crimes like office work, scheduled, supervised, and as dull to an outsider as accounting, until you noticed the pressure behind every decision. He kept violence low, not from charity, but because noise ruined business. He kept order by making his house the place people came to solve problems. Those skills kept him in power longer than most. The ledger of harm still filled. Debtors pressed by interests they could barely carry. Job sites steered by hands not visible in public meetings. Competitors nudged out by forces they couldn't see, and whole neighborhoods taught that some doors answer quicker if you pay. He dodged the long prison terms that closed the careers of peers in other towns. That outcome speaks to his caution, not to innocence. You can measure influence by absence. When he was gone, the absence of a single voice that could draw a line left others to improvise. Some shone under the looser order. Some misread the room and paid for it in court. Across the river, partners kept their step because they had learned that steady beats loud, a lesson he had been teaching since the first skiff crossed with cases under tarps. Federal agents who had built careers studying him kept their notes and trained younger colleagues to chase patterns, not headlines. Local police learned that raids without follow-through just taught operators to move rooms. Prosecutors learned to love charts. Defense lawyers learned to question every inch of a warrant. Think of the people who sat across from him in small living rooms over the years. A bookmaker who had underpaid. A captain who wanted a bigger slice. A club owner who needed time. A steward who had to be reminded where lines were. He treated each as a file to close, not a stage for emotion. That calm can feel like mercy, even when the outcome rests on quiet compulsion. It also made him the rare leader whose style created fewer enemies than most. Resentment runs downhill in every hierarchy. In his house, it stayed at a simmer until money in a vault tipped it to a boil. Time gives distance, and distance helps with clarity. His climb mirrored a century of change. Old world loyalties transplanted to American streets. A national market in contraband created by a constitutional amendment. A formal truce among rival city bosses. Televised exposure, modern surveillance, and new racketeering laws. Through it all, a man from a coastal Sicilian town used patience to turn a border into an asset. The crimes linked to his name: bootlegging, illegal betting, high-interest loans, extortionate pressure, manipulation of unions, corruption of public duties, and a corridor that investigators tied to narcotics, even as he denied involvement map onto the major illegal markets of his era. He didn't invent those markets. He consolidated them in a region that learned to prefer peace over spectacle. Walk the river road at night, and you still feel the logic he followed. The water drowns out stray sounds, the bridges carry ordinary life, and deals done in kitchens travel further than deals made in bars. He built a system that matched the setting. That is why it lasted. That is why even decades after he was gone, people who study this world still point to him when they talk about how to make hidden economies look like background noise. He proved that a person with a steady hand can keep many plates spinning, as long as he understands that the only thing more powerful than fear is habit. He made habit his weapon, his shield, and his epitaph, all without raising his voice. Stories about him kept traveling in low voices, passed along at kitchen tables when younger listeners asked why certain streets felt calmer than others, why arguments ended after a phone call, why the same faces seemed to handle every tug-war over a bar, a card room, a truck route. People didn't quote speeches. They described a posture. He listened more than he spoke. He settled problems by measuring them, not by making a show of strength. He didn't chase all the money in the room. He built paths that guided money to him. Those paths began before he had a desk of his own. The boy from Castellamare stood to the side and watched elders fix disputes in patios shaded by stone walls. In New York, he walked blocks where bread cooled on windowsills and learned which men had the patience to run a city's hidden trades like a ledger rather than a parade. The shadow from Sicily, the warrant tied to a 1,913 killing, taught him to avoid any light he didn't control. He left the old country's legal trouble behind and gave no interviewer a chance to make that past his headline. The lesson stayed for life. Let rumor tire itself out while you build the next meeting. By the time Prohibition turned a border into a highway, he had the temperament to make order out of chaos. Night runs across the river, trucks slip down farm lanes, barrels in barns, cars that looked like every other car. He didn't romanticize any of it. He scheduled it. He moved pieces when checkpoints stiffened. He accepted that a season would be lost on one road and found on another. He trusted men who didn't want to be noticed. Those decisions turned him into the quiet center of a region whose map had more to do with currents and customs than with county lines. He shifted just as smoothly when the dry law died. Games took the place of liquor. Number slips traveled from counters to back rooms. Phones rang with wagers on fights and pennant races. Operators rotated lines so a warrant reached an empty chair. Dice and cards kept modest rooms alive. Collectors visited with a tone that made stubbornness seem expensive. The house's take stayed steady because he understood that predictability keeps customers. He built roots for cash and roots for trust. He gave himself the cover of a job that fit those aims. A funeral parlor gave him a respectable place to sit, a reason to see anyone, and hours that never looked suspicious. The undertaker name stuck because it matched the suit and the schedule. Inside that office he met businessmen, clergy, relatives of the grieving, and lieutenants who came for instructions. The room never looked like a headquarters. It looked like every other small enterprise in a town that prided itself on modesty. He rose in Buffalo after Angelo Palmieri's death without a public announcement. He placed steady men at key doors. Bridges, ward clubs, union halls, produce markets, trucking depots. He learned who on the city payroll valued quiet neighborhoods more than statistics in a press release. He asked for regular envelopes, not windfalls. He fixed splits when two earners reached for the same hour at the same bar. He told captains to run their turf as if they planned to hand it to a son rather than squeeze it dry for one season. When the Castellammarise War burned down New York, he stood with his hometown crowd and then accepted the new structure that rose from the ashes. Defined territory, a forum to stop fights before they spread, a logic that made money without needless feuds. Sitting at that national table gave him a way to protect his district's borders and to resist anyone who tried to plant a flag near the river without permission. He used that chair to argue for caution, order, and respect for lines on the map that most people never saw. He built a second spine across the border. In Hamilton, he found partners who shared his taste for discipline. Giacomo Lupino, steady and soft-spoken. Johnny Papaglia, firm with crews that liked to test edges. Toronto maintained balances that could be nudged but not bullied. Farther east, Montreal's figures ran their own affairs, while allowing the corridor to hum. That mesh kept gambling steady and moved cash in a way that felt like ordinary commerce. It also gave investigators a problem that outlasted several careers, because it crossed jurisdictions as smoothly as a family crossing for dinner. Union influence turned into his most elegant tool. In Buffalo, a laborer's local gave him reach into concrete, demolition, trucking, and warehouses. A steward could make a week easy or hard. A supervisor who wanted a pave job finished before winter learned which list to respect. Friends of the house got contracts that went smoother. Skeptics paid in delays that couldn't be traced to a single act. This wasn't a billboard crime. It hid in sign-in sheets, grievance forms, and calls that officers returned faster for some than for others. When agencies later built Hobbs Act cases around such pressure, they had to translate custom into coercion for juries who understood that cities run on favors too. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they hit the fog he had spent years laying down. He kept a hand in cash trades that explained foot traffic. Jukebox and vending routes put collectors in diners and taverns all week. Cigarette tax gaps on either side of the line made small gray markets worth the ride. A lost crate here, a misrouted shipment there, a truck that made one extra stop no headline, just a drip that filled a bucket. These trades fit his rule: useful, quiet, and easy to restart after a pause. The first big light shone on him during the Cafover hearings, when television taught the country words it had never heard from a senator's mouth. He didn't turn that show into his stage. He let others sit under lamps. His name made lists. His face ran beside captions. He stayed home. Appalachian, years later, splashed his network across front pages without a conviction attached. A trooper's curiosity turned a country lunch into a roll call. The public saw him among peers who ran cities far larger than his. The civic bridge between respectable names and private arrangements broke that day for good, and in Buffalo, a local dignitary's career ended in a week. He absorbed the lesson and retreated another step behind the curtain. Valakai's testimony in 1963 pulled back a different curtain. A structure with bosses, captains, and rules stepped from rumor into sworn words. In that outline, Western New York had a seat with his name on it. The country now had a vocabulary to describe positions he had occupied for years. He didn't argue with any camera. He kept drives short, calls shorter, and meetings smaller. Narcotics haunted the file with a question mark that never quite vanished. Agents tracked overseas shipments into Quebec, traced Canada to U.S. routes, and arrested people who moved packages and collected payments. Informants tied familiar places to unfamiliar goods. He forbade that trade, according to everyone who speaks for him. He preferred income that didn't set neighborhoods on fire. Even so, the corridor he maintained served many uses, and some men used it for whatever paid. Courts did not hand down a verdict that named him personally in that market. Investigators never stopped believing that the path he protected made other people's choices possible. The history sits with both realities: denial at the top, arrests at the edges, routes that existed, and a gap where a confession would be. He managed crises the same way he managed weeks, through routine. When pressure rose after big hearings, he reduced contact and tightened ranks. When police raided a phone room, he refitted another in a different apartment. When a bookmaker and a club owner fought over a night, he split the time and wrote down who got which holidays. He kept everyone busy enough that ambition cooled by Monday. He avoided dramatic punishments because drama multiplies itself. He believed that demotions, transfers, and delays work better than any show of fury. Then came the drilled boxes in 1968. Stacks of cash tied to his son and a close relative became a shorthand for resentment. Men who had risked attention to keep operations running looked at photographs and heard figures that made them feel like laborers carrying someone else's safe. That bitterness bled into every meeting, every order that took a day longer to be obeyed, every request from Niagara Falls that felt heavier than last year. He faced that storm with his old tools, patience and structure. It wasn't enough to erase the image. It never is. Rochester found its own voice in that moment. Frank Valenti promised calm with more local say. Younger men liked the pitch. The old man's reply stayed the same. Two centers mean confusion. Confusion draws heat. Heat costs everyone. He won the argument on paper and lost it in hallways. After he died, Rochester's disagreements turned into a mess that gave reporters the spectacle he had spent a lifetime avoiding. It stood as a warning about what happens when the person who knows where the edges are no longer sits in the chair. Through all of this, he avoided the sentences that ended the careers of peers in other cities. That outcome came from disciplined habits, few phone calls, brief phrases, trusted couriers, and a refusal to make himself the voice on any wire. He put distance between himself and the act. He used fronts that could pass any casual look. He relied on social capital in neighborhoods where people liked calm more than crusades. That didn't make him clean. It made him hard to convict. The list of offenses tied to his house fills a page because it spans eras. During Prohibition, he coordinated the illegal movement of alcohol. Later, he ran illegal gambling in various forms, numbers, bookmaking, card, and dice parlors across western New York and along the cross-border corridor. He oversaw loan operations that charged steep interest and used pressure to collect. He used extortion through protection and influence to keep businesses compliant. He manipulated union processes to steer jobs, contracts, and staffing. He maintained ties to figures engaged in cross-border schemes that included currency and contraband, and investigators tied people around him to narcotics routes, even as he denied personal involvement. He cultivated relationships that blunted enforcement and gave his organization room to operate. These acts appear in files, indictments, and testimonies across decades. Some ended in convictions for men below him. Some remained allegations because the final proof never reached a jury. Together, they describe a system he built and guarded. Set against that ledger are the routines he used to make such things look ordinary. Envelopes collected on time, sit-downs that prevented violence, agreements that divided neighborhoods so two people could earn in the same town without starting a feud. Those habits prolonged his reign and reduced public harm of the sort that leads to angry marches and emergency meetings at City Hall. They did not erase the pressure felt by debtors, the lost bids, the careers stalled in union halls, the neighborhoods taught to accept that an unseen hand could decide who worked. His calm did not make his world harmless. It made it durable. Age eventually told him what rivals and agents could not. In his 80s, he kept the same suit and the same manner. He moved slower and trusted committees. To settle disputes he once handled himself. He still shook hands at church, still sent wreaths, still nodded at wakes. When his heart failed in 1974, the networks he'd laid down didn't collapse. They sagged. A panel took over decisions. Canada kept its balance because the relationships there had never pivoted on one face. Buffalo's union ties kept jobs moving for a time. Rochester drifted into its own storm. Prosecutors kept filing the kind of cases that his design had taught them to build. Patient, layered, aimed at patterns rather than scenes. So his story ends where it began, with habits. He turned patience into an instrument. He turned a river into a shield. He turned a border into a seam. He turned crime into administration. He kept his public life plain and his private work organized. He dodged the endings we expect for men in his place because he understood that the safest path is the one no one watches walk by. His name still hangs in the air in western New York with the tone reserved for elders, not shouted, not praised, not spat, just placed on the table like a fact. If you stand near the water at night, the falls drown out every stray noise, and in that hush you can imagine him sitting at a small desk, a lamp on, a pen near an empty page he would never fill. He preferred memory to ink, He preferred a nod to a speech. He preferred a promise made in a living room to a contract with a seal. He left behind a region that learned his rhythm and, for a long time, lived by it. He left behind a record that shows how one person's steady hand can shape the gray parts of a map as surely as laws shape the bright ones. And he left behind a lesson that belongs in any city with a bridge and a river. If you make something feel like background noise long enough, most people will stop hearing it until someone turns down the volume and realizes it has been there all along. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Stefano Magaddino here, thanking you for joining me on a quiet journey through loyalty, patience, and power. If this story helped you drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.